Before we get started, close your eyes with me. Seriously, close your eyes, just for a second. Now, imagine you're working in a field and its main source of revenue has been declining by double digits. Jobs have gone down by 1/3 in 6 years, and the President of the United States was frequently undermining the legitimacy of your entire industry.
It's all fake news. It's all fake news.
Welcome to Canadian media. We're at the center of a drastic decline, there's no doubt about that. But that also creates a juncture at which we can work towards a drastic shift. Now, nursing an entire industry back to health is a monumental task, but I'm going to propose a few areas where I believe we should focus first. And I also got a few other millennial Canadian journalists together so that we could talk and they could share their thoughts too. The digital era has changed our industry and people's expectation of it.
And when I was at digital media startups in the US, I saw the negative impact of the ad model on the quality of the journalism, as well as just the work-life balance of journalists at large, right? You're kind of like running on an assembly line, trying to push out as much content as possible, and you're not thinking about the impact of journalism, which is like really what we should be doing as journalists. We should be serving the public, right?
But the irony is, despite the constant want for stories, the output has still suffered. A recent study by Canada's Public Policy Forum looked at about 20 Canadian communities and found that the amount of stories reported dropped by half over the last decade. With the lower amount of reporting, stories are falling through the cracks for any number of reasons, but audiences that are assumed to be niche aren't necessarily small. For example, Connie Walker, a Cree reporter at the CBC, spoke to a class I teach and shared about how CBC's Indigenous Vertical got started. It was small and mostly a home for aggregated stories, but its audience numbers and page views were remarkably high. Eventually it grew and had dedicated reporters. If that growth is an example of anything, it's that there's an appetite for Indigenous stories. And I'd broaden it to say that there's an appetite for stories from other marginalized communities. Whether it's CBC Indigenous, The Discourse, Sisterhood Media, which tells long-form stories about marginalized women, or the tech outlet, The Logic, all of these have a niche focus and a niche audience. It's not necessarily detrimental to focus on local news and news from marginalized communities. These stories also interest people who aren't necessarily part of their communities. These audiences are there and they're hungry. Another thing I'll suggest is that we need to make room for innovative storytelling.
There's like a lack of risk-taking, I feel. People aren't trying to do anything interesting.
How can I make this story interesting in a different way? And I think that's really the hard part in trying to, as a journalist, adapt to this landscape that's like constantly changing.
So there's an excitement about the way that we consume news and the way that we can make it more accessible and make it more fun in a lot of ways. And that means that we can make journalism actually interesting and appeal to a broad network of people who consume things differently.
Innovation in journalism is something that isn't as plentiful lately. And sure, we're running on fewer resources, and I get that it's a risk to divert journalists from the day-to-day. But trying new things isn't necessarily a costly risk that will be the absolute death of us if it goes wrong. But the way to go about forming news initiatives is in conversation with young journalists. We have more insight into the direction the industry is heading, and we're more familiar with the perspectives that have been developed in this current generation. And moreover, we're the journalists who are going to be here reporting long after many who are currently here have retired. Let's say the industry is a car that has broken down on the side of the street. Now, is it worthwhile to dedicate the remaining staff in legacy newsrooms to continue pushing the car, trying our hardest to keep up with the speed limit? Or should we take a moment and fix the engine? What we need to do is dedicate time and resources to research, to learning new skills, taking stock of what has worked around the world, and to diagnosing the problems, and then creating an action plan. In 2017, the Shattered Mirror report consisted of 100 pages assessing the state of Canadian media and suggesting solutions. It's a great start to putting an analysis on paper, and it needs to continue. The media industry is suffering right now, but I am hopeful. Journalism will always be needed, and we need to come together to make sure it recovers.